Welcome. I'm Leslie Nips of Convivium Constellations, and welcome to this ongoing video series on the Orders of Love from Family Constellations work founded by Bert Hellinger. I sent out earlier last week my first video on the Order of Love with respect to including and honoring what is, and the second video is going to be on the next Order of Love with respect to belonging. Now, it's a really interesting few days for me to be meditating on this theme, as my news has been filled with the events from Charlottesville, Virginia, where the far right and hate groups have been gathering and there have been clashes and even deaths. And from one point of view, this is a very dark and difficult struggle over the question of belonging. Belonging has a light side and it has a dark side. It has a light side when it gives us meaning and connection, safety, a place to grow, a place to contribute. And it has a dark side when it means being connected to a mob or to hate or to things that are about opposition. It can also be quite dark when it means belonging to histories and families that we understandably don't like, where there's been abuse or violation. And so we have a mixed relationship with this whole belonging thing. And actually, living in California like I do, I am surrounded by people, and I used to be one of them myself, who intentionally separated from family in order to become themselves, to find a new family, a new way to belong. For many psychotherapeutic approaches, separation is the key to healing. But the Order of Love with respect to belonging both supports this movement and offers an interesting critique of it. The Order of Love with respect to belonging claims that belonging is inevitable. It cannot be avoided. It simply comes with the package of being human, with being alive, with being born into a family. And that systems, including families, have a certain logic to them in which they seek to keep those who belong inside the circle of belonging. Now, when that's healthy and good and yummy, that's all good. The sort of the rules of belonging, the patterns of belonging, the rhythms and traditions all support a healthy, transparent kind of belonging. But when the belonging has been violated in some way, when someone has been outcast, when there's been a violation that hasn't been acknowledged in some way, when there's some deep trespass going on, sometimes when there's history that was simply absolutely overwhelming, then, well, we all know, we've seen it in families. People get thrown out, people get forgotten, people run away, people just get lost somehow or another. Histories get lost, events get lost, people get lost. And the response to that in family systems is to figure out some way to overcome this outcastness, this exclusion, this lostness. And unfortunately, the way in which systems tend to try and correct for this errant lostness is through other means that aren't always quite as healthy as the internal logic would wish for the family. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine there's a family with a father and a son. And the father's father was not a great father. He was maybe an alcoholic, neglectful, abandoned the family. So the father, who had been the son of that father, that neglectful father, grows up, has a child of his own, and decides, you know what? I don't want my father's influence on my son. I'm not going to talk about him. We're certainly not going to visit him. We're not going to contact him in any way. But not only that, we're not going to talk about him. We're going to actually kind of pretend like he never existed because he was such a bad influence. And I'm going to be a different kind of a father, and I want a different kind of an experience for my son. Now, this is all extremely well-intentioned, but here's where the logic of the system, of the family, of the order of love with respect to belonging starts to come in. Because as the son ages and is kind of kept away from his grandfather, unconsciously he becomes to reach for this lost one. He functions as the part of the system that recognizes that everyone belongs no matter how bad they are, and lo and behold, he starts to become like his grandfather, somewhat to the horror of the father. Now, what I'm saying here does not suggest that the father should take his son and the rest of the family to Thanksgivings with his own father, particularly if his own father is still neglectful, violent, unkind. We're not talking about reaching out by being in some kind of contact if that contact is destructive to people. Sometimes separation really is necessary. But there has to be some way to acknowledge that this man, the grandfather, who is the father's father, belongs, brought life, and is the grandfather of this grandson. And here's the way to do it. And I want to thank Bert Hellinger for these very, very beautiful sentences. Let's just for a moment imagine the father, instead of refusing to talk about his father and trying to forget him and exclude him and make sure he never has any influence on his family ever again, let's imagine he says in his heart these words: "Dear Father, thank you for my life. It has been very difficult being your son, but I still thank you for my life. I honor the dignity of your fate and everything that you carry, which is probably beyond my imagining. Thank you for my life and the life of my son. And I ask you to please bless us as we choose another way." This is the way we acknowledge the belonging of everyone who does indeed properly belong to the family system. The father in this example can't exclude his own father. He actually can't even do it, not really. And by trying to, he only ends up having funny repercussions that he did not intend. The only way in which he can avoid these kinds of unconscious repercussions, with perhaps his own son repeating his grandfather's experience, is by finding a good place in his heart for his own father. It might mean still being separated and again not going to Thanksgiving dinner or exposing his son, but he does have a place in his heart and in the family for the man who helped bring him into this world. This is the order of love with respect to belonging. So I invite you to consider in your own family, who are the people who may have been excluded for lots of good and understandable reasons, or the sands of time, just we forgot about them, the children who died too young, the people who went off to war, the people who did terrible things. When we find a good way in our hearts for these people to belong, then in some ways the impact of that exclusion begins to diminish, and they can just have a good place and belong in the way that the order of love with respect to belonging insists that all things belong. I believe that this is the work before us, not only as individuals in our own families, as complicated as that can be, but as a culture where issues of belonging are so fraught and so upside down and doing so much damage as in today in Charlottesville. So I invite you into these sentences. Thank you for my life. I honor the dignity of your fate. Please bless me as I choose a different way. And know that you always belong. You belong here on this planet with these people and to your ancestors, no matter how complicated or troubling they may be. So thank you for joining me for this Order of Love with respect to belonging. Please share your comments on my blog and come back next week where I'm going to take a look at the Order of Love with respect to seniority, role, and contribution.